In the sleepy Cotswolds village of Chipping Norton, a young tea-shop waitress, Lily Carter, vanishes into the dusk, leaving only a folded apron and a trail of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of blackmail, hidden letters, and a mysterious stranger's sketches. From a tense tea shop to a lonely mill, clues point to a scandal Lily fled from and a greedy shopkeeper's threats. Can Miss Marple follow the threads to find Lily before the shadows claim her for good? A gripping tale of deception and discovery awaits. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of Chipping Norton. The village of Chipping Norton lay cradled in the soft folds of the Cotswolds, its golden stone cottages glowing warmly under the September sun. The high street, a narrow ribbon of cobblestones, wound past a butcher, a bakery, and a post office, all presided over by the steadfast presence of St. Edmund's Church, whose spire pierced the sky like a gentle reprimand to the modern world. At the heart of this unassuming tableau stood the Silver Teapot, a tea shop where the clink of china and the murmur of village talk blended into a comforting hum. It was here, on a crisp afternoon, that Miss Jane Marple found herself, seated by a window with a view of the street, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. Miss Marple, with her soft white hair and deceptively mild blue eyes, had come to Chipping Norton to visit her old friend Mrs. Clara Bantry, whose husband, the Colonel, had recently purchased a charming cottage just beyond the village green. The invitation had been warmly extended, and Miss Marple, ever fond of observing human nature in new settings, accepted with pleasure. Now, as she sipped her Earl Grey, she surveyed the tea shop with the keen interest of one who saw more than she let on. The room was cozy, with lace curtains and polished oak tables, each adorned with a small vase of Michaelmas daisies. A faint scent of freshly baked scones wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the fragrance of tea. At the counter stood Lily Carter, the young waitress, a slight girl of 20, with a pale complexion and dark hair pinned neatly beneath a white cap. Her movements were quick, but not entirely steady. Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her hand as she poured tea, the way her eyes flickered toward the door each time the bell jingled. "Is everything quite all right, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing, as she accepted her cup. Lily's smile was fleeting, almost forced. "Oh, yes, ma'am," she replied, but her glance darted sideways, toward a man in a dark coat who had just entered. The stranger chose a table in the corner, half hidden by a potted fern. He was perhaps 40, with sharp features and a restless air, his fingers tapping a leather-bound notebook he placed before him. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, observed how the room's chatter dipped when he entered, as if the village held its breath. Mrs. Pym, the baker's wife, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. Old Mr. Travers, nursing a cup of tea, shot the stranger a wary glance. Even Mr. Harold Grayson, the tea shop's owner, paused in his polishing of a silver tray, his broad face tightening for a moment. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and birdlike, missed none of this. She had a way of noticing the small things, the unspoken tensions, the fleeting expressions that others overlooked. Lily, she saw, was particularly affected. The girl's apron strings were knotted too tightly, as if in haste, and her cheeks flushed when the stranger's gaze lingered on her. He opened his notebook and began to write, his pen scratching with purpose, though Miss Marple could not see what he wrote. She made a mental note of his presence, sensing it was no mere coincidence. As the afternoon waned, the tea shop emptied, leaving only Miss Marple, the stranger, and Lily, who busied herself wiping tables. The light outside turned golden, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, thanked Lily for the tea and stepped into the cool air, her mind already turning over the day's observations. She had promised to meet Mrs. Bantry for supper, and the walk to the cottage was short, but something held her back. She lingered by the tea shop's window, watching as Lily moved to clear the stranger's table. Their exchange was brief, but Lily's face drained of color, and her hand clutched the edge of the table as if for support. By dusk, when Miss Marple returned to the high street after a stroll, the tea shop was closed, its windows dark. She paused, her curiosity sharpened by a sense of unease. Mrs. Bantry, meeting her at the cottage gate, was full of the day's gossip, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The next morning, the village was alight with a single startling fact. Lily Carter had vanished. Her apron, neatly folded, was found behind the counter of the silver teapot, but of the girl herself there was no trace. It was as if the dusk had claimed her, leaving only questions in its wake. Chapter 2. The Village Whispers. The morning sun cast a pale glow over Chipping Norton, its light filtering through the mist that clung to the meadows beyond the village. The news of Lily Carter's disappearance had spread like wildfire, igniting whispers in every corner of the high street. By the time Miss Jane Marple descended the stairs at Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, the air was thick with speculation, and the breakfast table was a stage for fervent discussion. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of a fresh mystery, was already armed with a pot of tea and a torrent of village gossip. "Jane, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, pouring tea with a vigor that sloshed it into the saucer. "Lily Carter gone. Vanished without a word. They found her apron, you know, folded as neat as you please behind the counter of the silver teapot. But no sign of her, not a hairpin, not a footprint. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her habitual calm, adjusted her spectacles and regarded her friend with a faint smile. "It is curious, Clara," she said, her voice soft but laced with that quiet authority that made one listen. "A girl does not simply vanish, not without reason. There is always a thread to follow, if one looks closely enough." She accepted her tea, her mind already sifting through the details of the previous day. Lily's trembling hands, the stranger's notebook, the sudden hush in the tea shop when he entered. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a pause linger, launched into the facts as she knew them. Lily, she explained, was an orphan, raised by her aunt, Mrs. Elsie Carter, a widow who kept a small haberdashery shop on the edge of the village. For 2 years, Lily had worked at the Silver Teapot, serving tea and scones with a quiet efficiency that endeared her to customers, if not to Mr. Harold Grayson, the shop's owner, who was known for his sharp tongue. But lately, Mrs. Bantry confided, leaning forward, Lily was different. Jumpy, like a cat on hot bricks. Mrs. Pym told me she saw Lily looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to pounce. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had appeared as if by magic, clicked softly in her lap. "Fear, Clara," she mused, "is a most revealing emotion. It betrays what lies beneath the surface. Of what or whom was Lily afraid?" Her mind returned to the tea shop, to the stranger in the dark coat, Mr. Victor Lang, as Mrs. Bantry had later identified him, and his scribbling. She recalled, too, the way Mr. Grayson's eyes had followed Lily, not with affection, but with a peculiar intensity, as if weighing her every move. After breakfast, Miss Marple donned her hat and coat, announcing her intention to take a morning walk. "To clear my thoughts," she said, though Mrs. Bantry, wise to her friend's ways, suspected it was less about fresh air and more about ferreting out clues. The high street was alive with activity, shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps and villagers exchanging hushed theories. At the post office, Miss Marple paused to chat with Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, whose sharp memory and sharper tongue made her a font of village knowledge. "Poor Lily," Miss Weatherby said, sorting letters with a practiced hand. "Such a sweet girl, but nervy these past weeks. I saw her myself, last Tuesday, collecting a letter postmarked from London, it was. She tucked it away quick, like she didn't want anyone to see." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained placid. "A letter from London," she repeated thoughtfully. "Did you happen to notice the handwriting?" "Bold, masculine," Miss Weatherby replied, her lips pursing. Not the sort of letter a girl like Lily would expect, if you ask me. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A letter from London, hidden with haste, suggested secrets, perhaps dangerous ones. Her next stop was the silver teapot, which, despite the morning's chill, was crowded with villagers eager for news. Mr. Grayson stood behind the counter, his broad face flushed as he deflected questions with forced joviality. "Run off, that's what she's done," he declared to a skeptical Mrs. Pym. "Young girls these days, always chasing dreams." But Miss Marple, lingering over a cup of tea she scarcely needed, noted the strain in his voice, the way his hands fumbled with a teapot, polishing it until it gleamed unnaturally. She engaged Betty, the other waitress, in conversation, complimenting her on the scones and gently steering the talk to Lily. Betty, a rosy-cheeked girl with a tendency to chatter, was eager to oblige. "Lily was ever so quiet lately," she confided, glancing nervously at Mr. Grayson. "Last week, she got a letter hidden in her apron pocket when I asked about it. She was pale as anything after reading it, like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she filed away this confirmation of Miss Weatherby's account. As she left the tea shop, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the church. A small crowd had gathered, and at its center was Mrs. Elsie Carter, Lily's aunt, her face streaked with tears. "She's gone, my Lily," she wailed to the vicar, who patted her arm ineffectually. Miss Marple approached, her presence calming, and offered a few kind words. Mrs. Carter, clutching a damp handkerchief, was incoherent with grief, muttering about Lily's foolish notions and bad company. But when Miss Marple suggested visiting Lily's room, Mrs. Carter hesitated, then agreed, leading her to the small shop where she lived above her haberdashery. The room was sparse, with a single bed, a chipped washstand, and a wardrobe that creaked when opened. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for the overlooked, knelt to peer beneath the bed. There, caught in a crack of the floorboards, was a torn scrap of paper, its edges frayed. She retrieved it with care, unfolding it to reveal a few scrawled words. "Meet me at dusk. The old mill." The handwriting matched Miss Weatherby's description: bold, masculine, urgent. Miss Marple slipped the paper into her handbag, her mind racing. The old mill, a derelict structure by the river, was a lonely place, perfect for secrets or danger. The letter, the stranger, Lily's fear, and now this note formed a pattern, though its shape was not yet clear. She thanked Mrs. Carter, who seemed oblivious to the significance of the find, and returned to the high street, where the village's whispers grew louder. As she walked, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of villages like Chipping Norton. They were, she knew, like her own St. Mary Mead places, where secrets simmered beneath a veneer of tranquility. Lily's disappearance was no mere flight of fancy. It was a thread in a tapestry of motives and fears. The stranger, Mr. Lang, with his notebook and sharp eyes. Mr. Grayson, with his uneasy manner. And now this note, pointing to a clandestine meeting at dusk. Each was a clue, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would follow them until the truth emerged, as it always did, in the end. Chapter 3. The Tea Shop's Secrets. The silver teapot, bathed in the soft light of a late morning, hummed with the subdued energy of Chipping Norton's villagers, who gathered not just for tea, but for the latest scraps of news about Lily Carter's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more by the window, her knitting a familiar prop in her hands, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of gentleness and acuity. The lace curtains fluttered faintly, and the scent of warm scones drifted through the air. But beneath the cozy familiarity, a current of unease ran strong. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a mild expression, took in every detail: the hurried whispers of customers, the clatter of teacups, and the forced cheer of Mr. Harold Grayson, who bustled behind the counter with an air of distraction. Miss Marple had returned to the tea shop with a purpose, her mind fixed on the torn note she had found in Lily's room. "Meet me at dusk. The old mill." The words, scrawled in a bold hand, suggested a clandestine rendezvous, and she suspected the tea shop held clues to why such a meeting had been arranged. She sipped her tea, a Darjeeling this time, and let her gaze wander, noting the small things that others might overlook. Mr. Grayson, for instance, was polishing the same silver teapot he had worked on the previous day, his movements jerky, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. His broad face, usually florid, was pale, and his smile, when he greeted a customer, seemed to strain at the edges. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear as she caught his attention. "The tea is excellent today. Lily always poured it so well, didn't she?" The mention of Lily was deliberate, and she watched his reaction closely. His hand faltered, the teapot clattering slightly against the counter. "Oh, Lily," he said, recovering quickly. "Flighty girl, that one. Probably off to London, chasing some silly dream. Young folk these days, you know." His laugh was hollow, and Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She had seen such deflections before, in men who wished to hide something. In her village, there had been a grocer once, with a similar laugh, who had been smuggling pilfered goods behind his shop. Mr. Grayson, she sensed, was no mere shopkeeper caught in a village scandal. She turned her attention to Betty, the other waitress, who was wiping down a nearby table with more vigor than necessary. Betty was a contrast to Lily, cheerful, plump, with a tendency to chatter that Miss Marple found most useful. Under the pretense of ordering another scone, she drew Betty into conversation. "Such a pity about Lily," she said, her tone sympathetic. "You must miss her dreadfully, working together every day." Betty's eyes widened, and she glanced toward Mr. Grayson before leaning closer. "Oh, it's awful, miss," she whispered. "Lily was ever so nice, but she wasn't herself lately. Last week I saw her with a letter. She stuffed it in her apron quick when she saw me looking. Went pale as a sheet after reading it. She did. I asked what was wrong, but she wouldn't say a word." Betty's voice dropped lower. "And Mr. Grayson, he was always watching her, like he thought she'd steal the teaspoons." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, though her mind was racing. The letter again confirmation of Miss Weatherby's account at the post office. A letter from London, hidden from prying eyes, and now a meeting at the old mill. She thanked Betty, who scurried off to fetch the scone, and resumed her knitting, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as the stitches in her hands. As the morning wore on, the tea shop grew busier, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small incident. A customer, a local farmer named Mr. Thomas Reed, entered and exchanged a few sharp words with Mr. Grayson at the counter. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple, with her knack for hearing what others missed, caught fragments. "Gets and no more excuses." Mr. Reed's face was red with anger, and Mr. Grayson's was tight with something that looked like fear. The exchange ended abruptly, with Mr. Reed storming out and Mr. Grayson retreating to his office at the back of the shop. Miss Marple, finishing her tea, decided it was time to leave, but not before a final observation. As she passed the counter, she noticed a small key, half hidden beneath a stack of napkins, glinting in the light. It was not the sort of key one used for a door too small, too delicate. A drawer, perhaps, or a lockbox. She filed this away, along with Mr. Grayson's unease and Betty's whispered confidences. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Elsie Carter, Lily's aunt, at her haberdashery shop. The shop was dim, its shelves crowded with ribbons and bolts of cloth, and Mrs. Carter was a shadow of her earlier self, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I don't know where she's gone," she said, her voice breaking. Lily was always a good girl, but she had notions thoughts above her station. "I told her to stay away from trouble, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple, seated on a creaking chair, offered gentle reassurances, but her questions were precise. Had Lily mentioned anyone new in her life? Had she seemed anxious about her work? Mrs. Carter's answers were vague, clouded by grief, but she did recall Lily's distress after receiving a letter. She burned it in the grate, Mrs. Carter said, pointing to a small fireplace. Said it was nothing, but her hands were shaking. Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the grate, where a few ashes lingered. She did not expect to find the letter intact, but the act of burning it spoke volumes. Lily had wanted to erase something evidence, perhaps, or a connection she feared. Thanking Mrs. Carter, Miss Marple left, her mind turning to the old mill mentioned in the note. It was a place she had not yet visited, but its isolation made it significant. A meeting at dusk, in such a lonely spot, suggested secrecy, and secrecy often meant danger. As she walked back to Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the village settling into the quiet of late afternoon, Miss Marple reflected on the threads she had gathered. The letter from London, Mr. Grayson's nervous demeanor, Betty's observations, and the note pointing to the old mill formed a web, delicate but growing clearer. She thought of a young woman in her own village, years ago, who had vanished after a similar meeting, only to be found hiding from a truth too heavy to bear. Lily, she suspected, was caught in something similar, a secret that had driven her to flee, or worse. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Chipping Norton's cobblestones. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked into her bag, resolved to visit the old mill at the earliest opportunity. The tea-shop secrets were beginning to unravel, and she would follow them, as she always did, with the patience of one who knew that truth, like a well-knit scarf, required care to reveal its pattern. Chapter 4. The Stranger in the Dark Coat. The afternoon light in Chipping Norton had taken on a golden hue, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Red Lion Inn. The inn, a sturdy building with ivy creeping up its walls, stood at the far end of the high street, its sign creaking faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple's steps were unhurried, her appearance that of a harmless elderly lady out for a stroll, but her mind was as sharp as ever, piecing together the fragments of Lily Carter's disappearance. The torn note from Lily's room, "Meet me at dusk," the old mill, and the whispers of a mysterious letter from London had deepened her curiosity. Now her thoughts turned to the stranger in the dark coat, Mr. Victor Lang, whose presence in the silver teapot had unsettled Lily so profoundly. Mrs. Bantry, with her knack for village intelligence, had identified Mr. Lang as a writer from London, lodging at the Red Lion while researching village life. But Miss Marple, who had seen many a writer in her time, doubted the simplicity of his story. The notebook he carried, the sketches she had glimpsed within it, and his keen interest in the tea-shop suggested motives beyond literary inspiration. She recalled a certain gentleman in her own village, years ago, who had claimed to be an artist sketching the church, but was later found to be spying on a neighbor's affairs. People, she knew, were rarely what they seemed. At the Red Lion, Miss Marple found Mr. Lang in the lounge, seated by a window with his notebook open before him. He was a lean man, with angular features and eyes that darted about like those of a bird of prey. His dark coat hung over the back of his chair, and his fingers, stained faintly with ink, tapped restlessly on the table. Miss Marple approached with her usual disarming smile, clutching a worn copy of a novel she had borrowed from Mrs. Bantry's shelf. "Mr. Lang, I believe?" she said, her voice mild. "I'm staying with Mrs. Bantry, and she mentioned you're a writer. I do so enjoy a good book, might I trouble you for a recommendation?" Mr. Lang looked up, momentarily startled, but his face smoothed into a practiced smile. "Of course, miss," he began, and she supplied her name with a modest nod. "I'm afraid my work is rather dull village histories, that sort of thing," he said, closing his notebook with a casual flick. But Miss Marple, ever observant, caught a glimpse of a detailed sketch, not of the village green or the church, but of the silver teapot's interior, complete with the counter and the door to Mr. Grayson's office. They chatted for a time, Miss Marple steering the conversation with the skill of one who could extract information. As deftly as she unpicked a tangled stitch. Mr. Lang was charming, his answers polished, but they lacked substance. He spoke vaguely of capturing the essence of rural life, and deflected questions about his notebook with a laugh. Just idle doodles, he said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when she mentioned the silver teapot. Miss Marple, her knitting now in her lap, noted his guarded manner and the way his fingers tightened on his pen. As she left the inn, thanking him for his time, Miss Marple's mind was busy. A writer who sketched tea-shop layouts was no writer at all, she suspected. His interest in Lily, his presence at the moment of her unease, and now these sketches pointed to a purpose more deliberate than he admitted. She thought of the note again. The old mill, a place of shadows and solitude. It was time, she decided, to see it for herself. The old mill lay a mile outside Chipping Norton, where the river curved through a copse of willows. The path was overgrown, the air damp with the scent of moss and earth. Miss Marple, her sensible shoes crunching on fallen leaves, approached the crumbling structure with caution. The mill's wheel was long still, its timbers weathered to a silvery gray, and the windows gaped like empty eyes. The place was desolate, yet it held a certain melancholy beauty, the kind that might draw a frightened girl to a secret meeting. She searched the ground near the mill's entrance, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. It was then she spotted it a glint in the grass, half hidden by a tuft of weeds. Kneeling with surprising agility for her age, she retrieved a small pearl-drop earring, its clasp bent as if torn off in haste. She held it up to the fading light, her heart quickening. Later, at the silver teapot, Betty confirmed it was Lily's, one of a pair she wore every day. She was so fond of them, Betty said, her voice trembling. A gift from her aunt, I think. Miss Marple tucked the earring into her handbag, her mind racing. The note had led Lily here, to this lonely spot, and now this earring suggested a struggle, or at least a hurried departure. But why the mill? And who had she met? The stranger, Mr. Lang, loomed large in her thoughts, his notebook a silent witness to his intentions. Yet she could not discount Mr. Grayson, whose nervous demeanor and sharp words with the farmer, Mr. Reed, hinted at secrets of his own. As she walked back to the village, the dusk settling like a soft veil over the fields, Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. The mill had been silent, but she had sensed a presence, as if the shadows themselves were watching. She thought of a young woman in her village, long ago, who had met someone in a quiet place and paid a price for it. Lily, she feared, might be caught in a similar web, one spun from fear and secrecy. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, Miss Marple shared her findings over a late supper, though she kept the earring to herself for now. Mrs. Bantry, agog with excitement, pressed for details, but Miss Marple only smiled and said, "There are threads, Clara, but they must be woven carefully. The stranger's sketches, the earring, the note, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that puzzles, like her knitting, required patience to reveal their design. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would press further, perhaps at the tea-shop or with Mr. Grayson himself. For now, she sipped her tea, her mind as clear and sharp as the evening star rising over Chipping Norton. Chapter 5. A pattern emerges. The soft light of a Chipping Norton morning filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the breakfast table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles idle for once. Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving together the threads of Lily Carter's disappearance with the precision of a seasoned seamstress. The torn note, the pearl-drop earring found at the old mill, the mysterious letter from London, and the curious behavior of both Mr. Harold Grayson and the stranger, Mr. Victor Lang, formed a tapestry of clues, each demanding careful consideration. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant, as Mrs. Bantry bustled about, recounting the latest village theories with her usual gusto. "It's the talk of Chipping Norton, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, setting down a plate of toast with a flourish. "Some say Lily ran off with a secret lover, others that she's been spirited away by gypsies. But I heard from Mrs. Pym that Mr. Grayson's been acting queerer than ever, snapping at customers, closing the tea shop early yesterday, claiming he was ill. Ill, my foot. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "People, Clara, often betray themselves in small ways," she said. "A nervous glance, a hasty word, these are the stitches that unravel a mystery." Her thoughts returned to the silver teapot, to Mr. Grayson's strained smile, and the small key she had glimpsed beneath a stack of napkins. She recalled, too, the heated exchange between Grayson and Mr. Thomas Reed, the farmer, their voices low but sharp with talk of debts. There was something amiss in the tea shop, she was certain, and Lily's disappearance was no mere whim of a flighty girl. Determined to follow the threads, Miss Marple set out for the high street after breakfast, her hat pinned neatly and her handbag clutched with purpose. The village was alive with its usual rhythm shopkeepers calling out greetings, children darting across the cobblestones, but an undercurrent of unease lingered like a faint discord in a familiar tune. At the Silver Teapot, the atmosphere was no less tense. The tables were half empty, and Mr. Grayson, behind the counter, looked haggard, his eyes shadowed as he served a customer with a curt nod. Miss Marple, taking her usual seat by the window, ordered a pot of Assam and let her gaze wander, noting the absence of Betty's usual chatter and the way Grayson's hands fumbled with the teacup. As she waited for her tea, Miss Marple's eyes fell on the counter, where the small key she had noticed before was no longer visible. She made a mental note of this, suspecting it unlocked something significant, a drawer, perhaps, or a box containing secrets Grayson wished to keep hidden. Her thoughts were interrupted by Betty, who brought the tea with a nervous smile. "It's not the same without Lily," Betty said, unprompted, her voice low. "Mr. Grayson's been in a state, locking himself in his office half the day. I heard him muttering about money troubles yesterday, something about owing someone." Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their gentle clicking, paused briefly. "Money troubles," she repeated, her tone encouraging. "That must be worrying for him." Betty nodded, glancing over her shoulder. "He's always been tight with the till, but lately he's been worse, counting every penny, checking the books late at night. Lily noticed it too, before she went." The girl's voice faltered, and she hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to ponder this new thread. Money troubles, a locked drawer, and a heated exchange with Mr. Reed. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern. Miss Marple thought of a case in her own village, years ago, where a shopkeeper's financial woes had led to desperate measures, including threats to a young assistant who knew too much. Could Lily have stumbled upon something Grayson wished to conceal? A debt, perhaps, or something more sinister? The letter from London and the note about the old mill suggested Lily was entangled in a web that extended beyond the tea shop, but Grayson's behavior was a knot she could not ignore. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a second visit to the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual efficiency. Under the guise of posting a letter to a fictitious niece, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Lily. "Such a shame about the poor girl," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "I hear she received a letter from London not long ago. Do you recall anything about it?" Miss Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of being consulted. "Oh, yes," she said, leaning forward. "A week ago, Tuesday it was. A thick envelope, postmarked from London, addressed to Lily in a man's hand. She came in herself to collect it, looking all nervous-like. I thought it odd, her being so secretive." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The letter, burned by Lily in her aunt's grate, had clearly held significance, perhaps a warning or a demand. As she left the post office, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Reed, the farmer whose argument with Grayson had caught her attention. She recalled his red face, his sharp words about debts unpaid. On impulse, she took a detour past his farm, a sturdy stone house surrounded by fields of grazing sheep. Mr. Reed was in the yard, mending a fence, and Miss Marple, with her knack for disarming strangers, greeted him warmly. "A fine day for work, Mr. Reed," she said, pausing by the gate. "I was just admiring your fields, such a contrast to the bustle of the tea-shop." Mr. Reed, a burly man with weathered hands, grunted in response, but her mention of the tea-shop sparked a reaction. "That Grayson," he muttered, hammering a nail with unnecessary force, "thinks he can dodge what he owes. I lent him money for that shop, and now he's stalling, saying he's short. Short, indeed." His voice was bitter, and Miss Marple, with her gentle probing, learned that Grayson had borrowed a significant sum from Reed months ago, promising repayment that never came. The conversation yielded little more, but it was enough. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Reed and returned to the village, her mind alight with possibilities. Grayson's financial troubles, the locked drawer, the mysterious letter, and Lily's fear were threads in a single fabric, she was certain. The earring at the old mill suggested Lily had gone there, perhaps to meet the sender of the letter, but what had driven her to flee or worse? And where did Mr. Lang, with his sketches and guarded manner, fit into this? As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the wool in her hands. The pattern was emerging, like a shadow taking shape in the dusk. Lily had been afraid, perhaps of Grayson's secrets, perhaps of something revealed in that London letter. The old mill, the earring, and now Grayson's debts pointed to a motive blackmail, perhaps, or a threat Lily could not escape. Miss Marple knew that patterns, like her knitting, required patience to complete, but she was determined to follow each thread until the truth lay bare. Chapter 6. A Nighttime Search. The evening air in Chipping Norton carried a chill, the kind that seeped through shawls and settled in the bones. But Miss Jane Marple was undeterred as she sat in Mrs. Clara Bantry's drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking with a steady rhythm. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows, yet Miss Marple's mind was far from the cozy warmth of the cottage. The threads of Lily Carter's disappearance, the torn note, the pearl drop earring, the mysterious letter from London, Mr. Grayson's financial woes, and the enigmatic Mr. Victor Lang had woven a complex web, and she sensed the truth lay hidden in the heart of the silver teapot itself. The small key she had glimpsed on the counter, the locked drawer in Grayson's office, and Betty's whispered hints of his late-night bookkeeping gnawed at her curiosity. A bolder step was needed, one that required a touch of daring. "Clara," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside with a purposeful air, "I believe we must pay a visit to the silver teapot tonight. After hours, of course." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a glint of determination that made Mrs. Bantry pause mid-sip of her cocoa. "Tonight?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her eyebrows shooting up. "Jane, you don't mean sneaking in? Like burglars?" Her tone was a mix of scandalized delight and nervous excitement, for she knew her friend's penchant for uncovering truths in the most unorthodox ways. "Not burglars, Clara," Miss Marple corrected gently, a smile playing at her lips. "Merely investigators. There is something in Mr. Grayson's office, I am sure, that will shed light on Lily's disappearance. A drawer, perhaps, or papers he does not wish seen." She recounted her observations, Grayson's strained demeanor, his argument with Mr. Reed about unpaid debts, and the key that had vanished from the counter. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for adventure, agreed, though not without a flutter of apprehension. The plan was simple yet audacious. Mrs. Bantry, with her network of village connections, had learned that a spare key to the tea shop was kept by Mrs. Pym, the baker's wife, who occasionally helped with deliveries. A discreet visit, under the pretense of borrowing a recipe, secured the key, a small brass affair, They felt heavy with possibility in Miss Marple's hand. By 10 o'clock, when Chipping Norton had settled into a quiet slumber, the two women slipped out of the cottage, cloaked in dark shawls, their footsteps muffled on the cobblestones. The high street was deserted, the moon casting a silver glow over the shuttered shops. The silver teapot loomed dark and silent, its windows like blank eyes staring into the night. Miss Marple, with a steadiness that belied her years, inserted the key into the lock, and the door opened with a soft click. Inside, the air was thick with the lingering scent of tea and polished wood. Mrs. Bantry, clutching her shawl, whispered, "This feels terribly wicked, Jane," but her eyes sparkled with the thrill of it. They moved swiftly to the back of the shop, where Mr. Grayson's office was tucked behind a curtained doorway. The room was small, cluttered with ledgers and teacups, and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on the drawer she had noticed earlier, its lock gleaming faintly in the light of her small torch. With a hairpin plucked from her hat, a skill she had honed in her youth and never advertised, she set to work. The lock yielded after a moment's deft maneuvering, and the drawer slid open with a faint creak. Inside was a ledger, its pages filled with meticulous entries, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a series of payments marked London account, sums far larger than a tea shop's takings could justify. Tucked beneath the ledger was a photograph, creased and worn, showing Lily Carter, her smile bright but her eyes wary, standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out with deliberate ferocity. Miss Marple's breath caught. The photograph was a clue, a tangible link to Lily's fear, but its meaning remained elusive. Mrs. Bantry, peering over her shoulder, gasped softly, "Who's that with her? And why scratch out his face?" Miss Marple, slipping the photograph into her handbag, shook her head. Someone Lily knew, and someone Mr. Grayson or another did not wish identified. This, Clara, is no mere debt ledger. It is a motive. Their search was cut short by a noise of faint rustle outside the shop, like footsteps on gravel. Miss Marple extinguished her torch, and the two women froze, their hearts pounding in the darkness. Through the office window, a shadow moved, fleeting but unmistakable. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, but the older woman's composure held firm. "Quickly, Clara," she whispered, guiding her friend back through the curtained doorway. They slipped out the back entrance, locking it behind them, just as the shadow paused at the front of the shop. In the moonlight, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the figure Mr. Thomas Reid, the farmer, his face grim as he peered through the tea shop's window. He lingered only a moment before vanishing into the night, but his presence confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions of a deeper connection. Reid's anger over unpaid debts, Grayson's secretive ledger, and now this nighttime vigil suggested a tangle of greed and fear with Lily caught at its center. Back at the cottage, Mrs. Bantry poured them both a restorative sherry, her hands still trembling. "Jane, that was positively thrilling and terrifying. What do we do now?" Miss Marple, seated by the fire, turned the photograph over in her hands, her mind racing. "We follow the threads, Clara," she said. "This photograph, the ledger, Mr. Reid's nocturnal wanderings, they are pieces of a puzzle. Lily knew something, or someone that put her in danger. We must find out who that man was, and why his face was erased." She thought of a case in her own village, where a young woman had hidden a photograph to protect a secret, only to find herself ensnared by it. Lily, she suspected, had been similarly trapped perhaps by Grayson's schemes, perhaps by the stranger, Mr. Lang, whose sketches hinted at a purpose yet unrevealed. The old mill where the earring had been found loomed in her thoughts, its shadows holding answers she had yet to uncover. As the fire died down, Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The nighttime search had yielded vital clues, but the pattern was not yet complete. Tomorrow, she would confront Mr. Lang again, and perhaps Mr. Grayson, probing their defenses with the gentle persistence that had unraveled so many mysteries before. For now, she tucked the photograph away, her mind as clear as the moonlight that bathed Chipping Norton in a quiet, watchful glow. Chapter 7. The Truth at Dusk. The pale light of a Chipping Norton afternoon filtered through the windows of Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with a quiet precision that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The photograph from Mr. Grayson's office, showing Lily Carter beside a man with a scratched-out face, lay on the table before her, its edges worn, but its secrets sharp. The ledger with its cryptic London account entries, the pearl-drop earring from the old mill, the torn note, and the whispered hints of Lily's fear had woven an intricate web, and Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, lurking in the shadows of dusk like the meeting Lily had been summoned to. Her nighttime search of the silver teapot had confirmed her suspicions of Mr. Grayson's duplicity, but the role of Mr. Victor Lang, the stranger with his suspicious sketches, remained unclear. Today she resolved she would unravel that thread. Miss Marple began her day at the Red Lion Inn, where Mr. Lang was known to linger over a late breakfast. She entered the lounge with her usual air of harmless curiosity, her handbag clutched and a polite smile in place. Mr. Lang was at his usual table, his notebook closed, but his pen tapping restlessly. "Good morning, Mr. Lang," she said, settling nearby with a borrowed newspaper. "I trust your research is progressing? Chipping Norton must offer such fascinating material for a writer." Lang's smile was tight, his eyes wary as he met her gaze. "It's a quiet village, Miss Marple," he replied, "but full of character." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple, with her knack for sensing the unsaid, pressed gently, mentioning the tea-shop and Lily's disappearance in passing. His reaction was subtle, a slight stiffening, a quick glance at his notebook, but it was enough. She shifted the conversation to London, probing his background with questions cloaked in innocent chatter about the city's bookstores and cafes. Under her relentless yet gentle questioning, Lang's composure began to fray. "I'm not just a writer," he admitted at last, his voice low. "I'm a private investigator, hired by a London family to find their son, Edward Marsh. He was involved with Lily years ago, before she came to Chipping Norton. They feared he'd fallen into trouble again." He hesitated, then added, "Lily was trying to leave that past behind, but someone was threatening to expose it. I was watching her, trying to learn who." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. The scratched-out face in the photograph, she realized, was likely Edward Marsh. Lang's sketches of the tea-shop suggested he was tracking more than just Lily, perhaps Grayson, whose ledger hinted at illicit dealings. "And did you find this person?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. Lang shook his head. "Lily vanished before I could. But I saw her arguing with Grayson the day before she disappeared." He looked angry, frightened even. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Lang's story rang true, but it was only half the picture. Grayson's role and the old mill remained the key. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of violet, Miss Marple returned to the old mill, driven by a certainty that it held the final clue. The air was cool, the river murmuring softly as she approached the crumbling structure. She searched the area around the mill's entrance, her torch casting a narrow beam. In a hollowed-out beam near the doorway, she found a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, tied with string, written in the same bold hand as the note from Lily's room. They were addressed to Lily, signed E.M., and spoke of love, regret, and a desperate plea to meet at the mill to escape a dangerous shadow in Chipping Norton. The letters confirmed Lang's story. Edward Marsh had been Lily's past, a romance that had ended in scandal. But one letter, dated a week before her disappearance, mentioned a threat. "He knows about us, Lily, and he'll ruin you if we don't pay." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The he was almost certainly Grayson, whose ledger and nervous demeanor pointed to extortion. As she tucked the letters away, footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. She turned to see Mr. Grayson, his face pale and eyes wild in the fading light. "Miss Marple," he stammered, "what are you doing here?" His voice trembled, and she saw the panic of a man caught in his own web. With the calm authority of one who had faced down many a cornered soul, Miss Marple held up the bundle of letters. "These, Mr. Grayson, tell a story. A story of a young woman you threatened, using her past to extort money. Where is Lily Carter?" Her voice was gentle but unyielding, and Grayson's shoulders slumped. "I didn't hurt her," he blurted, his words tumbling out. "I found out about her and Marsh letters she'd hidden in the tea shop. I needed money, with Reed pressing me for debts. I told her I'd tell her aunt, ruin her reputation, unless she paid. She met someone at the mill that night and ran off. I swear, I don't know where." His voice broke, and Miss Marple, studying his face, believed his fear, if not his innocence. Pressing further, she extracted a final detail. Lily had fled to a friend's cottage in the nearby village of Stawell. Miss Marple left the mill, the letters in her handbag and Grayson's confession ringing in her ears. She thought of a case in her village, where a young man had been driven to flight by a blackmailer's threats, only to be found hiding in shame. Lily, she suspected, had run to protect herself and her aunt from Grayson's greed. But the night held one last surprise. As she reached the village, she saw Mr. Lang watching from a distance, his dark coat blending with the shadows. His presence confirmed his role as an observer, not a villain, but Miss Marple knew the truth was not yet fully hers. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, she sat by the fire, the letters spread before her. "Clara," she said, as her friend hovered eagerly, "we are close to the end. Lily is alive, I believe, but frightened. Tomorrow we will find her." The dusk had yielded its secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, would follow them to their conclusion, as she always did, with the patience of one who knew the truth waited for those who sought it. Chapter 8. The Return of Lily Carter. The morning sun rose over Chipping Norton with a quiet promise, its rays piercing the mist that clung to the village's golden stone cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat at Mrs. Clara Bantry's breakfast table, her knitting untouched, her mind as clear and sharp as the light outside. The events of the previous evening at the old mill, Mr. Grayson's confession, a bundle of letters from Edward Marsh, and the revelation of Lily Carter's flight to a friend's cottage in Stawell had brought the mystery tantalizingly close to its resolution. The photograph with its scratched-out face, the ledger's cryptic entries, the pearl drop earring, and Mr. Victor Lang's role as a private investigator formed a pattern now almost complete. Yet Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that the final threads must be handled with care to bring Lily safely home. Mrs. Bantry, bustling with anticipation, set down a pot of tea with a clatter. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she exclaimed, her eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "Grayson a blackmailer, Lily hiding in Stawell. It's like something out of one of those novels you're always reading. What's next?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Next, Clara, we find Lily," she said, her voice steady. "But we must tread softly. She is frightened, and frightened people are like startled birds, apt to fly at the slightest noise." She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the letters, which had revealed Lily's fear of exposure and Grayson's greed. The photograph, she suspected, held the key to Lily's past with Edward Marsh, a scandal Grayson had exploited. Mr. Lang's pursuit of Marsh suggested the scandal reached beyond Chipping Norton, but Lily's safety was her priority now. With Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic assistance, Miss Marple enlisted the local constable, Mr. Pauck, a steady man with a slow but reliable manner. She presented him with the evidence, the ledger, the letters, and Grayson's confession of extortion, carefully omitting the details of her nighttime foray into the silver teapot. Pauck, though initially skeptical of an elderly lady's detective work, was persuaded by her calm authority and the weight of the evidence. "If the girls in Stawell will find her," he promised, adjusting his helmet. "And Grayson'll have some questions to answer." The journey to Stawell, a small village nestled in a fold of the Cotswolds, was brief but tense. Miss Marple, seated beside Mrs. Bantry in the constable's car, gazed out at the rolling fields, her mind sifting through the final pieces of the puzzle. Stawell was much like Chipping Norton, its high street lined with quaint shops and a single inn, the Blue Boar. Pauk, guided by Grayson's vague directions, led them to a modest cottage on the village's edge, where a young woman named Sarah Finch, a friend of Lily's from her schooldays, was known to live. Sarah, a nervous girl with a freckled face, opened the door with hesitation, her eyes widening at the sight of the constable. But Miss Marple's gentle presence reassured her. "We're here about Lily Carter, my dear," she said, her voice kind but direct. "We believe she's with you, and we mean her no harm." Sarah's resolve crumbled, and she admitted that Lily had arrived 2 nights ago, shaken and tearful, begging for a place to hide. Lily was found in the cottage's small parlor, curled in a chair by the window, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with fear. At the sight of Miss Marple, she started, but the older woman's calm demeanor steadied her. "Lily, my dear," Miss Marple said, sitting beside her, "you've been through a great deal, but it's over now. Tell us what happened, and we'll see you safe." Haltingly, Lily recounted her story. She had loved Edward Marsh years ago, a youthful romance that ended when he fell into trouble, a minor theft, hushed up by his family. She had come to Chipping Norton to escape the scandal, but Grayson, discovering her past through old letters she'd foolishly kept, had threatened to expose her to her aunt and the village unless she paid him. "He wanted money I didn't have," Lily said, her voice trembling. "When I got a letter from Edward, asking to meet at the old mill to help me, I went, but Grayson followed, and I panicked. I ran to Sarah's, thinking no one would find me here." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The earring at the mill marked Lily's frantic flight, and Grayson's extortion explained her fear. She reassured Lily that Grayson was in custody, his ledger and confession enough to assure charges. Mr. Lang, she added, would inform the Marsh family that Edward's whereabouts were no longer Lily's burden, securing her peace. Back in Chipping Norton, the village buzzed with the news of Lily's return and Grayson's arrest. The Silver Teapot, under temporary management by Betty, resumed its trade, its tables filled with villagers eager for the full story. Mr. Lang, his case closed, prepared to leave for London, thanking Miss Marple with a wry smile. "You're sharper than most detectives I've met, ma'am," he said, and she accepted the compliment with a modest nod. That evening, in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the fire casting a warm glow. "People, Clara," she mused, "are so often undone by their own desires. Grayson's greed, Lily's fear of her past, it's the human heart that spins these webs." Mrs. Bantry, pouring tea, sighed with satisfaction. "You've done it again, Jane. Solved the whole thing without breaking a sweat." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. "It's only a matter of observation, Clara, and a little understanding of what makes people tick." As Chipping Norton settled into its quiet rhythm, the mystery of the tea-shop girl who vanished at dusk was laid to rest, its threads neatly woven into a pattern only Miss Marple could have seen.